Dobry Utro Tuberovsky. So this morning, as a follow-up to my NATO video, I'm going to look at the origins of the Cold War. And hopefully my introduction won't bias you against this video. Anyhow, this has already been the subject of countless books, articles, programs, and whatever already. But surely no harm can be done by adding my 2 worth here. So in the conventional Western view, the Cold War was started by Soviet and/or communist aggression and overrunning Eastern Europe, forcing the poor, harassed, freedom-loving West to keep its plowshares beaten into swords for the next half-century. Western policy in dealing with this threat was divided between containment, keeping the Red Menace bottled like a dangerous genie, or rollback, pushing the Soviets out of Eastern Europe and maybe crushing communism altogether. As we saw, of course, it was the latter scene that did play out, but not as confirmation of the official Western line. The result was achieved without military force, and in its victory the West did not stop its expansion, nor did peace prove lasting, but I'm getting ahead of the story. The origins of the Cold War had something to do with a little thing called World War II. There were indeed 2 camps fighting within the Allied side. This division ran not so much east and west, but rather through every nation involved in the war, in Europe and in Asia, between those who saw the war as a new beginning and those who wanted to return to the pre-war status quo. The new or left or revolutionary forces, call them what you will, were looking to the USSR as a co-champion of the New World Order in the name of anti-fascism, while conservative interests looked to the Atlantic powers of the US and United Kingdom to preserve them from leftist insurgency or the Red Army. A middle group, quite broad at the time, as in Czechoslovakia, looked hopefully to both. This clash of interests was brought to a head as soon as the Soviet Army entered Eastern Europe on its end of the wartime front. It's interesting in examining Western scholarship how it's conveniently forgotten that the first rollback of the period was the rollback of fascism during the latter months of the war. This rollback by either the Soviet Army, insurgent partisans, or leftist political parties in the first post-war elections represented an existential revolutionary threat to those wanting a return to the pre-war order of things. Even the moderation of the Kremlin in those first post-war days could not ease conservative fears exemplified by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that the old world was passing away and a new and dangerous one lurked around the corner, dangerous to hereditary power and wealth. This threat had to be beaten back, whether it took the form of Soviet occupation or the wartime resistance, or leftist political parties and trade unions. What was feared in those early post-war years was not so much the destruction of democracy under communist rule as a dangerous extension of democracy that would make a return to the old order structurally impossible. Thus, this challenge had to be defeated, not accommodated, not integrated, but crushed by any means necessary in Europe and Asia, and if possible even within the USSR itself. So as though you were trying to say that there was no push by the Red Army, that it was all the West's fault? No. I'm saying that there was a mutual incompatibility between those forces wanting social change out of the war and those who did not. You must remember that the reason Britain went to war against Hitler was because his growing aggression destabilized the old Atlantic order of Europe, still mired down in the Great Depression. The West fought Hitler to restore the economy and boundaries of 1938. The USSR fought for a new order, favorable to itself, of course. The U.S. initially took a position somewhat in between, but as the New Dealers were systematically purged or neutralized by the Truman administration, the American Diplomatic Corps and State Department came to lean in the Churchillian direction, taking up the British mantle as defender of the old order. And then there were those, quite substantial as stated, who looked to both Allied camps equally, East and West, as agents of change, while preserving what was best of the old. But that was not to be. Those who fought in the anti-fascist resistance were, in the West, treated like a fifth column of Moscow, while many Axis collaborators could rehabilitate themselves and restore their place in society through a Cold War, which many of them hoped would become a hot one, as only the U.S. then possessed atomic weapons. It was hoped by many behind the Iron Curtain that a few atomic bombs lobbed on Moscow would liberate them from the Bolshevik hordes, which Hitler had failed to do. While in the USSR, those who had hoped the post-war world would create a more open society at home were to find themselves locked back into the old Stalinist ghetto. Those living in the West know the standard Cold War horror story of communist takeover and Soviet occupation, bringing socialism by brass knuckles and police dungeons, knocking freedom's teeth down its throat, from Stettin to the Baltic to Trieste on the Atlantic, in Churchill's phrase. What is left out of the standard mainstream Western consensus is how the same exact brutalities were committed in the so-called free world, subsidizing a right-wing royalist terror state in Greece, using Nazi collaborators because most of the really democratic wartime forces were on the left. Propping up Chiang Kai-shek's bankrupt Republic of China, then subsidizing its relocation to Taiwan as a one-party state, a rule established against the wishes of the native Taiwanese, whose resistance was brutally crushed in a major act of repression it was illegal to even mention until a few years ago. The same in South Korea, where Syngman Rhee was dusted off and brought in from Princeton, New Jersey, to serve as president of an Iraq-style U.S. regime staffed by Japanese collaborators trained in the finest Nipponese arts of torture. And again, any mention of the Jeju Island Rebellion and its repression by mass murder was strictly verboten in Free Korea and is still a touchy subject. And in Japan itself, where Occupation Chief Douglas MacArthur made sure to crush the workers' movement in Japanese industry by securing the emperor on his throne and the war criminals who had served him. While across Europe, Nazi collaborators and outright war criminals were, as stated, quietly reintegrated into society, or if too hot, allowed to slip out to Australia or the Western Hemisphere to assume new identities, which they would have gotten away with, until brought to book not by the democratic process of the Western Allies, but the interested prosecution of Holocaust survivors. If the communists subverted free elections in Poland or staged a coup in Czechoslovakia, the same was done by the anti-communists in post-war Italy and Iran. If communist insurgents were used to destabilize the Philippines or Greece, nationalist insurgents, many with nasty collaborationist records, were used in the same manner in the Soviet borderlands of West Ukraine and the Baltic. And honorable mention must go to the integration of fascist Spain and Portugal into the camp of the free world, the period equivalents of Saudi Arabia, who got a grandfathered free pass. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 is considered the overture to World War II, but it also foreshadowed the ideological outlines of the Cold War a decade later. Another crucial reason for Cold War was that the hot war in Europe and Asia had rescued the world corporate economy from the last icy grip of the Great Depression. The death shadows of recession and depression lurking over the shoulder were a major stimulus to keep the war machines oiled and their production expanding. If this production did not continue and expand, those deadly shadows would, so it was felt, surely catch up. And in truth, without a major political and economic restructuring, this was a self-fulfilling fact. War rescued the Western world and became a life-sustaining drug, with the U.S. doing anything to anyone to supply the fix. So, in surveying the post-war world, it's apparent that the self-interest of great power politics doomed to sacrifice an idealism which had defeated fascism. And one must ask, could it have been any different? When has the desire of a new world to rise from the ashes of the old not been betrayed by those in power? It's interesting to speculate on what might have been had the insurgent forces unleashed by the war, exemplified by the partisans of both East and West, been able to retain at least some of their influence. We might well have seen true grassroots democracy from Italy to Kazakhstan to Britain, in Poland and Greece, the crumbling of fascist bastions like Spain, no murderous arms race, no Korean War, no Vietnam War, no Berlin Wall, maybe even a world of peace, a world of plenty. But where's the fun in that? Uh-oh. Who did I piss off now? Hello. Sir Winston Churchill? I should have known by that cigar smoke coming through my line. That is a Churchill you're smoking, right? What's that? The blood, sweat, and tears of war were necessary to preserve civilization? Damn. Put that thing out. Anyway, yeah, okay, I see your point, but thanks to the Blitz, you did have a great opportunity to build something new, too. And now we're at the point that if new thinking doesn't take hold and restructure civilization, there won't be any left to preserve.